what are we going to learn in this video?
Well, again, this is Talking Hands, and what we're going to learn is how to harden wire. And we're going to show you several different methods of hardening wire and some tools to do it. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to show you some components that were made on our jig.
Well, I need to stop you here. What does hardening wire mean and why is it important?
Okay, that's a good question. Hardening wire is making the wire stiffer and more permanent. So when you know, the perfect wire would be totally flexible when it came off the spool.
Right.
And then after it was used, it would be perfectly stiff and it wouldn't bend at all. But there is no perfect wire, so because it has to be flexible on the spool, it's going to be flexible when it comes off the spool. And it needs to be flexible as we use it on our jig or as we use it with our tools. And then when we're done, then we have to make it hard so that the shape is permanent.
Okay, so it's locking in the design you made.
It locks in the design, it makes it stiffer so it hopefully won't pull apart.
Great.
So what we have here...
And there's just one method to do it, or...?
There's several methods.
Several, okay,
You were asleep.
I was. Sorry.
Yes, there's several methods to do it. The most common method, especially when we're making a component on our jig, is just using our nylon jaw pliers. And you can see that I've got this component and I'm squeezing it in several different orientations with our nylon jaw pliers. And when I started, the component was pretty three-dimensional. The loops weren't flat and they weren't very stiff.
And it also wasn't pretty.
Now you can see that it's essentially 2 layers of wire. It's pretty flat and it's a lot stiffer. And you know, in this piece we would use this orientation for the piece, and if I pull it in that orientation, you can see it's pretty firm. Now I haven't cut off the little wire tail, and before we would use this in a piece of jewelry, I would want to cut that off. But you can see that's how we harden that piece, just with something simple like our nylon jaw pliers. And we'll show it again here. Here's a component just as it came off the jig. And this is a little, it makes a little head pin here. You can use this component as a head pin. And you can see that it is pretty three-dimensional. Now what I'm going to do is squeeze it in the pliers and make it two-dimensional and make it permanent.
And so you squeeze more than once, obviously, and in different orientations.
Yeah, I like to squeeze it several times in different orientation. And you can see that the component is a lot flatter.
Super.
And it's more permanent because we made it harder. And the technique of squeezing wire and making it harder is called work hardening. And at the microscopic level, it generates a little bit of heat and tends to align the crystal lattices if you want to know the physics of it. Now here's another technique, and we don't always like this technique as much. The nylon jaw pliers give you more control, but you can use this technique, the nylon hammer. The nylon hammer will allow you to hammer something flat, and a nylon hammer will probably make the finished piece harder than if we used the nylon jaw pliers, but because you're hammering instead of squeezing, you don't have quite the control, and the piece may change shape a little bit on you, and you might have to do what we call hand finishing in order to get it back into the shape that you want.
Well, one thing that I used to do is I used to start with the nylon jaw pliers and then just do a few hammers with the nylon hammer, and that worked real well. That kept the shape. I started with the nylon jaw to get the shape held, locked in, and then I used the hammer. It works great.
That's not a bad idea. So there's 2 techniques, and we showed you the nylon hammer and the anvil. We're going to show you a bench block. A bench block is just a piece of steel, and we're going to put an ear wire on the bench block, and an ear wire needs a lot more hardening than these 2 pieces do.
And what you might want to do when you say the bench block is a piece of steel, show the side view that it's on some wood.
Well, not all bench blocks are.
I see. Well, this particular one.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we're going to use a metal chasing hammer to hammer this ear wire, because we really want the rounded portion to be a lot stiffer and more permanent. And so by hammering it, in essence, we're doing several things. We're sort of converting the rounded portion into an I-beam.
So you only hammer hammered the rounded part.
I only hammered the rounded part because that was the part that I really wanted to make a lot stiffer. And so you can see the rounded part is a lot stiffer now as a result of hammering it. And you can, if you look closely, you can visibly see that it's flattened.
Right.
And that's where we've converted it in essence into an I-beam. And now this ear wire, the shape is going to be a lot more permanent as a result of that.
I see.
Of course, you know, if you buy a machine-made ear wire, you'll see that they're stamped around there, and this is already taken care of. Now, in the metal chasing hammer, there's two types of chasing hammers, and you can see both of them here side by side. The one on the right here has a flat head, and you see it's not rounded. The one on the left has a rounded head. We prefer the rounded head on the left, and the reason is with the rounded head, if you look very closely here, you can see there's no marks from the edge of the hammer because you don't touch the edge of the hammer. It's rounded and you just touch the rounded portion. Whereas if this hammer, if I were to hammer this, I would have marks here and here where the rounded portion touched the wire.
I see. So, that's a good point.
We like this rounded head on the chasing hammer because the finished piece will be a lot better with fewer what's called tool marks from the hammer. So you can see that's what we do with an ear wire. If we don't recommend, we made this ear wire out of the colored wire because it shows up a little better than the brass wire, but we don't recommend making ear wires out of the colored wire because you don't know that the dyes might be carcinogenic. And one thing we would tell you is when you're hammering, you want to hammer wire that's one layer of wire, and you want to be very careful where you hammer 2 layers of wire. If we were to take this metal chasing hammer and hammer this piece very hard right here, it would end up breaking the wire because one piece, the above piece of wire acts like a chisel on the piece of wire below.
I see. When there's overlap.
When there's overlap, you want to be very careful about hammering. When there's one layer of wire, you're safe to hammer. So I could safely hammer this and it's not going to break it. But with 2 layers of wire, there's a danger of breaking it if you hammer where wire crosses wire.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's how we do hardening wire, and you can see the tools that we use to do it.
Super.